The sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the wide sky in shades of deep orange and soft purple. Out here in the middle of the countryside, the sky looked bigger than anywhere else. It felt like a giant bowl turning over the fields. Inside the farmhouse, the day wasn't over yet. In fact, for the woman standing at the kitchen sink, the hardest work of the day was just beginning. Her name was Martha, though most people around town just knew her as Tom's wife. She stood with her back to the room, her hands submerged in the warm, soapy water. She was scrubbing a heavy cast-iron skillet, trying to get rid of the smell of the fried potatoes she had made for dinner. The water was gray and greasy, but she didn't mind. Scrubbing gave her a moment to think. The kitchen was the heart of the home, but lately it felt more like an engine room. It was where the laundry spun, where the meals were prepped, and where the bills were spread out on the table like a messy deck of cards. The house was old, and it creaked and groaned when the wind blew, but Martha loved it. She loved the smell of the old wood and the way the sunlight hit the linoleum floor in the mornings, but today, there was a heaviness in her chest that she couldn't wash away. In the living room, the television was on. It was playing the news, but nobody was really watching. Tom was sitting in his recliner. It was a beige chair that had molded to the shape of his body over the years. He was leaning back with his eyes closed, snoring softly. He had been up since 4 a.m, fixing a fence on the south pasture. Martha looked over her shoulder at him. His hair was thinning, and his face was lined with dirt and wrinkles. He worked harder than any man she knew, and she loved him for it. But sometimes, looking at him sleeping in that chair, she felt a pang of loneliness, so sharp it hurt. They didn't talk much anymore. Not like they used to. When they were young, they would talk about everything: dreams of traveling, dreams of fixing up the barn, dreams of what their life would become. Now, the conversations were short. They were about the weather, the price of grain, or which tractor part needed replacing. The silence had grown between them slowly, like a vine climbing a wall, till it was just part of the structure. Martha drained the water out of the sink and watched. The gray liquid swirled down the drain. She grabbed a towel to dry her hands. Her skin was rough and red. Her nails were cut short because long nails just got in the way of working on the farm. She looked down at her hands. They were good, strong hands. Hands that could milk a cow, garden, and comfort a crying child. But they weren't the hands she remembered from her youth. That was the thing bothering her tonight. Tomorrow night was the annual community harvest dinner. It was the biggest event of the year for the county. Everyone went. There would be potluck dishes covering every table, pies cooling on the windowsills, and people dressed in their Sunday best. Martha usually looked forward to seeing her friends, but this year, she felt a knot of anxiety in her stomach. She knew what was waiting for her at that dinner. In the back of the town hall, off in the corner near the stage, sat the old piano. It had been there for as long as anyone could remember. It was a heavy, dark, upright, with scratches on the legs and keys that sometimes stuck if you pressed them too hard. But to Martha, that piano wasn't just a piece of furniture. It was a time machine. She walked over to the small desk in the corner of the kitchen. Under a stack of unopened mail and seed catalogs, there was a black and white photograph. It was curled at the edges. Martha pulled it out and sat down on a hard wooden chair to look at it. In the photo, a young girl was sitting at a grand piano. The girl was Martha, 30 years ago. She wasn't wearing overalls or a flannel shirt in the picture. She was wearing a white dress, and her hair was done up nicely. Her hands were hovering over the keys, poised and elegant. She looked like a different person entirely. Her eyes were closed, lost in the music. Martha ran her thumb over the girl's face. She remembered that day. It was a competition in the city. She had played a piece by Chopin, a difficult, swirling song that required your hands to fly across the keys. She hadn't won first place, but she had won something better. She had felt seen. She had felt like she had something special inside her, something that was hers and hers alone. But life had a way of changing the music. She met Tom shortly after that. She fell in love with his smile and his steady way of life. She moved to the farm, and the piano in the city became a distant memory. They didn't have room for a piano in the small house they first rented. And by the time they built this farmhouse and could have afforded one, there were bills to pay. There were animals to feed. There was no time for sitting at a bench practicing scales. The music in her life had been replaced by the hum of the refrigerator and the roar of the combine. Over the years, Martha had kept her talent a secret. It wasn't that she was ashamed, but it just didn't fit in with who she was now. How do you explain to your friends that you like to play classical music when you spend your days mucking out stalls? It felt like living a double life, except one half of the life had been asleep for a very long time. Every year at the harvest dinner, the local music teacher, Mrs. Higgins, would try to get people to perform. Usually, it was the kids. They would play Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, or choppy versions of folk songs. Everyone would clap politely and go back to their roast beef. And every year, Martha would watch the piano with a deep longing. She would feel her fingers itch to touch the keys, to feel the vibration under her palms. But she never did. She would just sit next to Tom, eat her pie, and keep her hands folded in her lap. This year, however, felt different. The silence in her own heart was getting too loud. She looked at the photograph of her younger self and felt a tear roll down her cheek. She wasn't sad for the girl in the picture. She was sad that the girl had seemingly vanished. Tom shifted in his chair and the snoring stopped for a moment. He let out a heavy breath and rubbed his eyes. "What time is it?" he asked, his voice gravelly with sleep. "It's nearly 7, Martha said, quickly wiping her cheek and tucking the photo back under the catalogs. "You should go on up to bed. You've got a long day tomorrow." Tom sat up straighter and stretched his arms over his head. "I think I will. My back is killing me." He stood up slowly, his knees popping. He walked over to Martha and gave her a kiss on the top of her head. He didn't notice the redness in her eyes. He just smelled the soap on her hands and the dinner in the air. "Did you make the potato salad for tomorrow?" he asked. "It's in the fridge," she said. "Good. Mrs. Higgins makes a mean ham, but your salad is the real reason people go," he said with a tired smile. "Don't stay up too late." "I won't," she promised. Tom walked out of the kitchen, his footsteps heavy on the stairs. Soon, the house was quiet again. The only sound was the clock ticking on the wall. Martha stood up and turned off the kitchen light. She stood in the darkness for a moment, looking out the window at the barn silhouetted against the dark sky. The moon was coming up, casting a silver light over the fields. It was peaceful, but it wasn't enough. She knew that tomorrow night she would sit in that crowded hall. She would listen to the chatter and the laughter. She would watch people eat and talk about the crops. And she would look at that piano in the corner. She would wonder what if. But deep down, Martha knew that this year, the wondering might not be enough. The music was trapped inside her, pushing against her ribs, demanding to be let out. She looked at her rough, work-worn hands in the moonlight. They looked old, but maybe, just maybe, they remembered how to fly. She walked towards the stairs, leaving the photograph hidden away, but carrying the memory of the music with her into the night. The silence of the house followed her, but for the first time in a long time, she was thinking about the noise she might make tomorrow. The door of the morning sun didn't just wake up the farm. It seemed to demand that it get to work. By the time Martha poured her second cup of coffee, the dust from the gravel road was already kicking up behind Tom's pickup truck. He was heading out to check the lower fields before the heat of the day set in. Martha stood by the kitchen sink, watching the taillights disappear around the bend of the driveway. The house felt big and empty again, settling into its daily rhythm of creaks and groans. She had a list of chores as long as her arm. But her mind was already miles away, focused entirely on the evening ahead. The community harvest dinner wasn't just a social gathering. For this small town, it was the event of the year. It was the one night where nobody worried about the price of soybeans or the forecast. It was about fried chicken coleslaw. And seeing people you hadn't seen since the last church service. Martha moved through her morning tasks mechanically. She fed the chickens, gathered the eggs, and wiped down the counters. But the knot in her stomach that she had felt the night before was still there, tight and twisting. Every time she walked past the photograph tucked under the seed catalogs, she felt a pull like a magnetic draw. She didn't look at it again. She didn't need to. The image of that young girl with the poised hands was burned into her mind. By late afternoon, the house was filled with the rich smells of preparation. Martha was in her element here. Cooking didn't require words. It just required intuition. She had 3 slow cookers going, and the oven was humming a low, warm tune. She was making her famous potato salad, a recipe she never wrote down. It was a pinch of this, a dash of that, and a whole lot of love. She chopped celery and boiled eggs. The rhythm of the knife against the cutting board, the only music she allowed herself for now. Around 5 o'clock, Tom came back in. He looked tired, his shirt stained with grease and dust. But he was scrubbing his hands at the utility sink with a rough brush. "Smells good in here," he said, leaning against the doorframe to watch her work. "The whole town is going to be asking for your recipe again." Martha smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "They can ask all they want. You know I'm never telling." Tom laughed, a deep rumbling sound. "That's right. Keep the mystery alive." He walked over to the table and looked at the bowls of food ready to be transported. "Are we about ready? I don't want to be late. Mr. Henderson always saves me a seat near the front." "Just let me get this dress on," Martha said, wiping her hands on her apron. "And wash your neck, Tom. You missed a spot?" Tom grumbled good-naturedly and went back to the bathroom. Martha stood alone in the kitchen for a moment. She took a deep breath. This was it. There was no turning back now. She walked into the bedroom and opened the closet. Past the overalls and the flannel shirts hung a simple dress. It was dark blue with small white flowers. It wasn't fancy, but it was the nicest thing she owned. She put it on and buttoned it up. She looked in the mirror. The woman staring back looked tired, her face lined from years of squinting into the sun, but she looked clean. She looked ready. They loaded the Tupperware containers into the back seat of the truck, cushioning them with towels so they wouldn't slide around. The drive to town only took about 15 minutes, but to Martha, it felt like they were driving to a different planet. As they got closer to the town square, the truck was joined by other vehicles. Families in sedans, farmers in beat-up trucks, and kids on bicycles were all converging on the large brick building that served as the community hall. The parking lot was already filling up fast. Bright orange safety lights from the volunteer fire department were set up near the entrance, and the sound of laughter drifted through the open windows of the truck. Tom parked the truck and killed the engine. "All right, let's go get some food," he said, opening his door. Martha stayed in her seat for a heartbeat longer. She stared at the double-glass doors of the hall. Light was pouring out of them, spilling onto the concrete steps. She could hear the muffled noise of a crowd inside, the clatter of dishes, the low roar of dozens of conversations happening at once. It sounded warm and inviting, but it also felt like a wall she had to climb over. "You coming?" Tom asked, poking his head back in. "Yes," Martha said, forcing her voice to sound steady. "I'm coming." She grabbed her purse and stepped out into the cool evening air. The pavement crunched under her shoes. She took Tom's arm as they walked toward the entrance. It was a habit they had developed over the years, a way of anchoring each other when they stepped inside. The heat and noise hit them like a wave. The air was thick with the scent of roast beef, gravy, cinnamon, and coffee. Long tables were draped in white plastic cloths, weighed down by mountains of food. At the far end of the hall, a stage had been set up with a few microphones on stands. Almost immediately, neighbors started waving them over. "Tom. Martha. Over here." They navigated through the crowd, saying hello, shaking hands, and accepting compliments on the food they had brought. Martha placed her potato salad on the table, right next to a glazed ham. People were already lining up with paper plates, their eyes wide with hunger. Tom led them to a table near the middle of the room, surrounded by other farming families. Martha sat down. She unfolded the napkin in her lap and looked around. Everyone was talking. The Hendersons were discussing the new road project. The Millers were arguing about high school football. It was chaotic and loud and utterly normal. But Martha's eyes were scanning the room, looking past the people. She found it almost immediately. In the far corner of the hall, opposite the food tables, sat the piano. It was tucked away slightly, almost as if it were hiding. It was an old, upright, dark wood with a bench that looked a little too low to the ground. It was currently serving as a resting place for 3 coats and a lady's purse. Seeing it made Martha's heart skip a beat. It looked smaller than she remembered. Or maybe she was just bigger now. Her life had expanded to fill the spaces around her with obligations and chores, shrinking the space for things like joy and music down to a tiny, neglected corner. She watched as the town's music teacher, Mrs. Gable, walked by the piano. Mrs. Gable was a sweet woman in her 70s with bright blue hair and a patience for children that Martha deeply admired. Mrs. Gable moved the coats off the piano bench and sat down. She opened the lid, revealing the black and white keys. A hush fell over the table near the piano. Mrs. Gable began to play. It was a simple, cheerful tune meant to accompany the meal, but the room was so noisy that the sound got lost before it even traveled a few feet. People were talking louder to be heard over the music. The clinking of silverware against paper plates created a rhythmic clatter that drowned out the melody. Mrs. Gable played well enough. She hit the right notes, but her playing was stiff, mechanical. It lacked the fire, the soul, that Martha remembered from her own youth. After a few minutes, Mrs. Gable stopped playing to take a sip of water. Someone accidentally bumped into the side of the piano, shaking it, and Mrs. Gable looked flustered. She closed the keyboard lid and stood up to go get some food. Leaving the instrument sitting there alone again, Martha watched the empty bench. It was like a magnet pulling at her very bones. She could feel the phantom sensation of keys under her fingers. Her hands resting in her lap twitched slightly. It was a physical ache, a deep desire to connect with something she had lost. "What's wrong with you tonight?" Tom's voice broke into her thoughts. He was watching her with a concerned look. "You haven't touched your roast beef. You've been staring at that corner all night." Martha blinked and looked at her husband. His face was kind, but confused. He didn't know. He had never really seen her play. They met after she had already stopped. To him, she was just Martha. The farmer's wife, the cook, the cleaner. "I'm fine," she lied, picking up her fork. "Just tired, I guess." She took a bite of the meat, but she couldn't taste it. Her eyes drifted back to the piano. The evening was young. The talent portion of the night, the part where people got up on stage to sing or tell jokes, this wasn't scheduled for another hour. But the piano sat there, silent and waiting. It felt like an old friend she had abandoned, standing in the shadows of the party, waiting for her to come home. She looked at her hands again, holding the plastic fork. They were strong hands. They had carried heavy burdens. But right now, they felt incomplete. The music wasn't just a hobby from the past. It was a piece of her identity that had been locked away. And tonight, in the middle of the noise and the crowd, she could hear it calling to her louder than ever before. The meal went by in a blur of noise and commotion, exactly the way it always did. Plates were scraped clean, coffee cups were refilled for the 3rd time. The volume in the hall seemed to climb higher with every passing minute. Martha sat politely in her chair, nodding along with the conversation. But her mind was far away from the talk of tractor tires and the high school football scores. She felt like she was underwater, watching the life of the party happen from behind a thick wall of glass. She watched Mrs. Gable, the sweet but tired music teacher, walk back up the small wooden steps to the stage. The older woman tapped on the microphone a few times, sending a sharp, screeching feedback noise through the speakers that made everyone wince and cover their ears. All right, settle down, folks," Mrs. Gable's voice boomed, echoing off the brick walls. "Let's clear the plates away and get started with the entertainment portion of the evening." Collective groan went through the room, followed by a ripple of laughter. The entertainment portion was always hit or miss. It was usually a mix of off-key singing, children reciting poems they forgot halfway through, or old farmers telling jokes that were older than the hills. But it was tradition. You couldn't eat the ham without listening to Little Johnny play the harmonica poorly. Volunteers from the 4-H club started clearing the tables, stacking the plastic cups and scraping the leftovers into big trash bins. The air in the room shifted. The intimate feeling of dinner turned into the stiff formality of a show. People leaned back in their chairs, crossing their arms, ready to be entertained, or ready to take a nap. Martha's heart rate picked up. She watched the piano sitting alone on the stage. It was angled slightly toward the audience, the lid propped open to catch the light. It looked so empty up there. The first act was the pastor's wife singing a hymn. She had a lovely voice, but she was nervous, and her hands shook as she held the microphone. The room was respectful, mostly. A few people near the back continued their conversations in loud whispers, not even trying to be quiet. Martha felt a flash of annoyance. Why couldn't they just listen? Next came a little boy playing a violin. It was painful to hear. The sawing sound made everyone shift in their seats. The boy forgot the notes halfway through, stood frozen for a terrifying 10 seconds, and then ran off the stage crying to his mother. The room erupted in sympathetic applause, but the energy in the hall had dipped. The awkwardness was spreading like a thick fog. People were checking their watches, looking for the exit doors, or signaling for more coffee. Mrs. Gable came back to the microphone, looking flustered. She shuffled her index cards, her brow furrowed in worry. It was clear that the lineup was falling apart. The next scheduled act, a man who was supposed to play the guitar, was nowhere to be seen. It seems we have a small gap, Mrs. Gable said into the mic, her voice wavering slightly. Is there anyone else who wants to come up? Maybe a joke? A magic trick? Anyone? The silence that followed was heavy. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was the kind of silence that happens when nobody wants to be the first to move. People looked at their shoes, looked at the ceiling, or suddenly became very interested in the crumbs on the table. The mood in the room turned from boredom to restlessness. The hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen seemed louder than the stage. Martha looked at Tom. He was busy cutting a slice of apple pie that Mrs. Henderson had dropped off at their table. He was completely at ease in his own world. He had no idea the storm that was brewing inside her. She felt a sudden, sharp pang of something, a mixture of fear and adrenaline. She looked at her hands resting on the table. They were scarred from the farm work, the skin rough and dry. She thought about the picture hidden at home, the girl in the white dress with the smooth hands. That girl hadn't disappeared. She was still there, buried under layers of duty and silence. Waiting for a moment just like this. Martha's heart was hammering against. Her ribs so hard she thought the person sitting next to her might hear it. It felt like a physical weight pressing on her chest. Do it, a voice whispered in her head. It wasn't a ghost. It was her own voice, the one she usually ignored. Asterisk, just do it, before the moment passes. Asterisk, what's wrong? Tom asked, noticing she was trembling slightly. You look pale. Are you feeling sick? Martha opened her mouth to say yes, to say she needed to go home. It would have been so easy to just pack up and leave. To go back to the safety of the farm where the only expectations were the animals and the crops. But then she looked up at the stage again. She saw Mrs. Gable looking helpless. She saw the beautiful, empty piano gathering dust in the corner. No, Martha whispered, her voice barely audible over the noise of the crowd. No, I'm not sick. She pushed her chair back. It made a loud screeching sound against the linoleum floor. It cut through the chatter like a knife. At the table next to them, the mayor stopped talking. Tom froze, a forkful of pie halfway to his mouth. Martha? Tom asked, looking at her with wide eyes. What are you doing? She didn't answer him. She couldn't. Her throat felt tight, like she was choking on the secret she had kept for 30 years. She stood up. Her legs felt shaky like a newborn calf trying to stand for the first time. She smoothed the front of her blue dress, a nervous habit. I have to go up there, she said, finally looking Tom in the eye. Tom looked at the stage, then back at her. A look of pure confusion washed over his face. Up there? Why? You aren't in the program. I know, Martha said. Her voice was shaking, but there was a steeliness underneath it that surprised even her. I have to. She turned away from him before he could say anything else. Before he could stop her or tell her she was being silly, she couldn't look back. If she looked back, she knew she would lose her nerve. She began the long walk toward the front of the room. To her, it felt like walking down a long tunnel. Every step was an effort. As she moved, heads began to turn. People noticed the farmer's wife leaving her seat. They noticed the strange look on her face. Conversations trailed off. One by one, the neighbors watched her pass. Martha kept her eyes fixed straight ahead. She didn't look left or right. She focused on the piano. It was her target, her lifeline. The room seemed to stretch and warp. The sounds of the hall, the coughing, the whispering, the rustling of coats faded into a dull roar in her ears. All she could hear was the thumping of her own heart. Mrs. Gable was standing by the microphone, looking relieved when she saw Martha approaching. She probably thought Martha was coming up to help with the sound equipment, or to tell her something important. "Martha, thank goodness," Mrs. Gable whispered as Martha climbed the steps onto the stage. "Do you know where the guitarist went?" Martha didn't answer. She walked past Mrs. Gable without a word. She smelled the old woman's lavender perfume and the dust of the stage curtains, but she didn't stop. She walked straight to the piano. The stage lights were bright, hot halogen lamps that made her squint. Standing in that spotlight felt like standing on the surface of the sun. She was exposed. The entire town was behind her, hundreds of eyes staring at her back. She felt the heat of their gaze. She reached the bench. It was a simple wooden bench with a worn velvet cushion. She turned around to face the room. From the stage, the crowd looked like a sea of faces. Some were confused. Some were bored. Some were just curious. She saw Tom sitting at their table. He had stood up. He was staring at her, his fork hovering in the air, his mouth slightly open. He looked completely shocked. Martha took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the stuffy air of the hall. She felt small, but she also felt incredibly tall. This was the point of no return. There was no sneaking back to her seat now. She turned and sat down on the bench. It creaked under her weight. The piano keys were white and black, smooth and cool. They smelled faintly of lemon polish and old wood. She rested her feet on the pedals. It felt like coming home after a very long trip. Her hands hovered over the keys, trembling just a little. The room went quiet. It wasn't the polite quiet from before. It was a confused, expectant silence. People were waiting to see what the farmer's wife was going to do. Was she going to make an announcement? Was she going to sell Girl Scout cookies? Martha closed her eyes for a brief second. She blocked out the lights, the crowd, and the expectations. She called back the feeling of the music. She remembered the melody she hadn't played in decades. She let her mind empty of the harvest, the bills, and the loneliness. She was just a pair of hands and a heart full of song. She opened her eyes. She placed her fingers on the keys, finding the starting chord. And then, with a pressure that was firm and gentle all at once, she pressed down. The sound that came out of the instrument wasn't a shy, uncertain note. It was a chord struck with a confidence that seemed to belong to a stranger. It rang out deep and full, cutting through the stale air of the hall like a knife cutting through warm butter. The vibration hummed through the wooden floorboard and up the legs of the bench, settling deep into Martha's bones. For a second she froze, terrified that her fingers would betray her. But then her right hand moved, almost as if it had a mind of its own. She didn't start with a simple tune. She didn't play Happy Birthday or Jingle Bells. She launched into something complex, something stormy and beautiful. It was a piece by the Russian composer Rachmaninoff, a song she had practiced 1,000 times in her bedroom 30 years ago. The notes cascaded down the keyboard like a waterfall, fast and heavy. For the first 10 seconds, the reaction in the room was not awe, but confusion. The people in the back, who had been talking loudly about the price of fertilizer, stopped mid-sentence. The mayor, who was checking his watch, looked up with a frown. A few teenagers near the door, who had been whispering and laughing, went silent. They all stared at the stage. They saw the back of the blue dress, the gray hair pulled up in a bun, and the shoulders of a woman they thought they knew. And they heard music that sounded like it belonged in a grand concert hall in a city, out in a dusty town hall in the middle of nowhere. The music was demanding. It insisted on being listened to. The melody wasn't just pretty. It was angry and sad and joyful all at the same time. It swelled and crashed against the walls. The low notes rumbled like thunder in the distance. and the high note sang like a bird trapped in a storm. Martha's fingers were flying. She was amazed at how icily it came back. It was like riding a bicycle, except the muscles in her hands remembered more than her brain did. Her fingers, which were usually stiff and swollen from gripping steering wheels and pulling weeds, were suddenly limber and strong. They knew exactly where to go. She looked down at the keys. They were a blur of black and white. She wasn't reading music. There was no sheet music in front of her. She was playing from memory, pulling the notes out of the dark corners of her mind where they had been hiding for decades. She thought about the young girl in the photograph. She wasn't playing for these people. She was playing for that girl. She was telling her that she hadn't been forgotten. Tom was still standing by his table. He had dropped his fork. The clatter of it hitting the plate had been completely drowned out by the music, but he didn't even notice. His mouth was open slightly. He looked at the woman on the stage. That was his wife. That was Martha. The woman who made his coffee every morning, the woman who mended his shirts, the woman who complained about the muddy boots. He had never seen this side of her. He had never even known it existed. He felt a strange tightening in his chest, a mixture of pride and confusion. Why had she never told him she could do this? The silence in the room grew heavier, but it wasn't an empty silence anymore. It was a listening silence. The chatter had completely died out. You could feel the atmosphere change. The restlessness vanished. People stopped looking at their phones. They stopped looking at the exits. Every single pair of eyes in the hall was fixed on the corner of the stage. Mrs. Gable, the music teacher, was standing near the microphone with her hands clasped over her mouth. She knew music. She knew how hard this piece was. She looked at Martha's posture. Martha wasn't hunched over the keys, timid and cautious. She was leaning forward, attacking the piano with passion. Her head was bowed, her eyes closed, completely lost in the sound. Mrs. Gable felt tears prick her own eyes. She had been trying to get this town to care about music for 20 years. Here was a farmer's wife doing it in 5 minutes. The song moved into a slower section. The thundering notes softened into a gentle, weeping melody. The sound was so tender it made the air feel thinner. Martha's hand slowed. Her left hand played a steady heartbeat rhythm, while her right hand teased out notes that sounded like tears falling on glass. In that quiet moment, the vulnerability of the performance hit the audience. They weren't just hearing a song. They were hearing a confession. They were hearing years of unspoken dreams, years of silence, and a lifetime of emotion that had been bottled up. It was raw and real. It wasn't polished like a studio recording. It was better because it was human. There was a slight hesitation here, a heavy emphasis. There are mistakes that only a professional would notice, but which made the playing more powerful to the regular people listening. Martha felt sweat beading on her forehead. Her shoulders began to ache, but she didn't stop. She felt a sense of release that was better than anything she had felt on the farm. It was better than a good harvest. It was better than a clean house. It was the feeling of being truly, completely herself. She wasn't Tom's wife. She wasn't the neighbor who brought potato salad. She was a musician. She was an artist. And the walls of the hall, the walls of her life, seemed to crumble under the weight of the music. She played on, her feet pressing the pedals, creating waves of sound that washed over the farmers, the mechanics, the teachers, and the children. She was giving them a gift she didn't even know she had. She was showing them that there was magic in the ordinary if you just looked close enough. The song began to build again. The gentle weeping melody turned into a triumphant roar. The notes got higher and faster, climbing toward a climax. Martha's hands were a blur of motion. She was pouring every ounce of her strength, every bit of her frustration and love, into the final chords. She could feel the energy of the room rising. The crowd wasn't just watching anymore. They were holding their collective breath. It was as if the entire town was suspended in time, waiting for the resolution, waiting to see where this strange, beautiful journey would end. Martha's fingers ached, but she didn't hold back. She reached the climax of the song, her hands flying down the keyboard in a rush of sound that filled every corner of the vast hall. She struck the final chords with a force that rattled the sheet music stand on the piano. Asterisk. Bam. Bam. Silence. Asterisk. She held her hands on the keys, letting the last vibration hang in the air. The sound faded slowly, echoing against the high ceiling until there was nothing left but the quiet sound of the ceiling fans spinning overhead. Martha sat there, chest heaving, palms slick against the ivory keys. She was terrified to open her eyes. She didn't know if they would clap, or if they would laugh, or if they would just go back to their pie. For a long, terrifying moment, nobody made a sound. She sat on the hard bench, her heart pounding in her ears, waiting for the world to come back into focus. The silence that followed the last note was the heaviest sound Martha had ever heard. It was thick and suffocating, pressing down on her shoulders. She sat frozen on the bench, her hands still resting on the keys, terrified to lift them. For 10 seconds, maybe 20, nobody in the hall moved. It was as if everyone had stopped breathing at the exact same time. The air felt electric. Charged with a kind of energy that the old building had never known before, Martha kept her eyes squeezed shut. She was mentally bracing herself for the worst. She imagined polite, pitying applause. She imagined someone coughing or a child asking loudly why the lady stopped playing. She thought about Tom. What if he was embarrassed? What if he thought she was making a fool of herself, acting like someone she wasn't? The shame burned hot in her cheeks. Then, a sound broke the quiet. It wasn't clapping. It was the sharp intake of breath, like a gasp, from someone near the front. It was followed immediately by the scraping of a chair against the floor. Martha opened her eyes and blinked rapidly, adjusting to the harsh stage lights. She looked out into the sea of faces. What she saw stopped her heart. The expressions weren't ones of confusion or boredom. Every face in the room was turned toward her. People were leaning forward in their seats, their mouths slightly open, their eyes wide. The mayor had taken his glasses off and was rubbing his eyes. The teenagers by the door weren't whispering. They were standing perfectly still, staring at her as if she had just landed a spaceship on stage. And then the release came. It started with Mrs. Gable, the music teacher. She was the first to stand up, clapping her hands together with a force that looked like it might hurt. But she wasn't smiling politely. She was beaming, tears streaming down her lined face. Suddenly, the dam broke. The applause didn't just trickle in. It exploded. It started as a roar and grew until it felt like the roof might lift off the building. It wasn't the usual polite clapping for a child's off-key performance. This was a wall of sound, a tidal wave of appreciation that crashed over the stage. People were standing up, all of them. In a matter of seconds, the entire room was on its feet. The farmers in their flannel shirts, the mothers with babies on their hips, the old men who usually complained about everything, they were all standing and clapping, some shouting bravo, an encore. Martha sat there, stunned, her hands hovering over the keys. She looked out at the crowd and saw something she hadn't seen in years. She saw a connection. She saw people looking at her not as Tom's wife or the neighbor, but as Martha. They were seeing a part of her soul that she had kept hidden away. Her eyes searched the crowd and found Tom. He was standing too, a few steps away from their table. He wasn't clapping wildly like the others. He was just standing there looking at her with an expression of absolute wonder. His eyes were red-rimmed, shining under the lights. He looked proud, deeply and fiercely proud. He gave her a small, slow nod. That nod meant more to her than the standing ovation of 100 people. It was an acknowledgement. It was him saying, asterisk, I see you. I really see you, asterisk. The heat in Martha's cheeks changed from shame to a humble gratitude. She realized she wasn't alone anymore. The silence in her heart had been broken, not just by the music, but by the people hearing it. She stood up slowly from the bench. Her legs felt shaky like jelly, but she managed to stand straight. She gave a small, awkward curtsy, something she hadn't done since she was a girl, and then a simple wave. The applause only got louder. Mrs. Gable rushed onto the stage, wrapping Martha in a tight hug that smelled of lavender and dusty fabric. You amazing woman, Mrs. Gable whispered in her ear. Who knew? Martha didn't know what to say. She just smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that reached her eyes. She felt lighter, as if she had dropped a heavy stone she had been carrying for miles. She walked off the stage, the applause still ringing in her ears. As she stepped down into the crowd, people reached out to touch her arm, to pat her shoulder, to shake her hand. "That was beautiful," Mrs. Henderson said, grabbing her hand with both of hers. "I had no idea you had that in you." "My goodness," said the town grocer, a man who rarely spoke more than 2 words to her. "That was the best thing I've heard in 50 years. Martha nodded and thanked them. But she was focused on getting back to Tom. She moved through the sea of well-wishers until she reached him. He didn't say anything at first. He just pulled her into a hug, right there in the middle of the noisy hall. He held her tight, and she rested her head against his flannel shirt, listening to his heartbeat, which was beating just as fast as hers. "I didn't know," he whispered into her hair. "I never knew you could play like that. I haven't played in a long time," she whispered back. "You should," he said, pulling away to look her in the eye. "You really should." He stayed for another hour, but the tone of the night had completely changed. The energy was different. It wasn't just a town gathering anymore. It was a shared experience. When Martha and Tom finally gathered their things and walked out to the truck, the air outside was crisp and cool. The drive home was quiet, but it wasn't the heavy, empty silence of the morning. It was a comfortable silence, filled with the things they didn't need to say. Tom reached over and took her hand as he drove, his rough thumb stroking her knuckles. He didn't let go until they pulled into the driveway. Inside the house, the familiar darkness greeted them. Martha walked to the kitchen and turned on the light. The room looked exactly the same as when they had left it, the dishes washed, the chairs tucked in. But to Martha, it looked different. It felt bigger, filled with new possibilities. She walked over to the desk in the corner and pulled out the photograph from under the catalogs. She looked at the girl in the white dress one last time. Then she walked over to the trash can and threw the catalog away. She cleared a small spot on the desk and set the frame up facing the room. "You were right to wait," she whispered to the girl in the picture. "But you don't have to hide anymore." Martha turned off the kitchen light and walked up the stairs, her heart full. The farm would still be there tomorrow. The chores would still be waiting. But she knew now that there was more to life than the work. There was music. There was passion. And there was a part of her that would never be silent again. She walked into the bedroom, where Tom was already waiting. And for the first time in 30 years, she went to sleep with a song in her heart, ready for the morning.